right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's edition of Sustainable Stow. I'm Tina McAndrew, the library director, and as you just heard, we are recording this to post onto Stow TV. Please keep yourselves muted just for background noise and ease of hearing. If you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put the question in the chat, and Kathy will answer it as she can. So for now, I will pass it off to Sharon.
Hi, good evening, everyone. And we've had a fabulous partnership with Randall Library and doing this series for about, what, 3 years? Uh, we're delighted to continue it, and we're delighted to have Kathy Sferra with us. I think um, Kathy has led the town's conservation efforts for the past 11 years. And that she was previously at Mass Audubon and the Nature Conservancy, where she was involved in protection and stewardship. So she's such a great proponent of keeping Stow the way we all love Stow, with its natural resources and stuff. And she tonight will talk to us about an exciting extension of what we're doing with the golf course. And really, we are sort of a leading edge about what it means for restoring land to its natural habitat. And it's not easy, but we are actually going to be doing it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks, Sharon, and thank you so much for having me tonight. As you mentioned, I've been leading this Stow Acres experiment for about 4 years now. And, it really has been a collaborative effort. So I want to acknowledge the other folks that have been involved on the town side, the planning department, the recreation department, as well as the town administrator has been personally involved in a lot of the meetings. We also have had strong involvement from Peter Brown from Stow Acres and Mark O'Hagan of MCO and Associates, our developer partner. So I just want to acknowledge them and say that we absolutely are a team who have been continuing to work together on this project. We came together in 2019. We continue to meet monthly to make sure that the overall vision for Stow Acres stays on track. And that's been very important to things moving forward. I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish at Stow Acres, and this project is really receiving quite a bit of statewide attention in terms of grants, in terms of technical assistance, and really serving as a model for other communities. Just yesterday, we actually hosted the statewide meeting of all of the local conservation staff across the Commonwealth at Stow Acres. So they got to learn about the project, and then they spent the afternoon in the field with us, actually doing species identification, helping certify a vernal pool that's out there. So really continuing to contribute to our understanding of what's on the property. So we've come a long way, and I'm really excited about what lies ahead. What Sharon asked me to do tonight is to really talk about our restoration efforts on the property. So that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about how we got to where we are today for folks that might be new to the project. But then most of my presentation will focus on the ecological restoration aspects of the project. As folks may know, we've been working over the last year on a master plan for the North Course. And I'm actually not going to talk about that today. We're going to reveal the draft next week at a meeting at Stow Acres, so I don't want to steal my own thunder, but the restoration is a component of that, so that's what I'll focus on. So I am going to share my screen. Hopefully, does that work? Okay. So just to talk a little bit about the background at Stow Acres, back in 2019, the town learned that Stow Acres was actively soliciting and receiving offers for the development of the 300 acres that they owned on both sides of Randall Road. And that was really concerning to us for a number of reasons. We knew that the property is more than 300 acres, really Stow's largest unprotected property. It was also our oldest and largest golf course and had important history as the site of really one of the first Black-owned and operated golf courses in the Commonwealth, or I'm sorry, in the United States, which was Mapledale Country Club. It was a 9-hole golf course that was located on the South Course. Mapledale is going to be celebrating its 100th anniversary in the next couple of years. And there is a group that's been actively working on thinking about how we acknowledge and commemorate that history at Stow Acres. The property was a very high priority in the town's open space and recreation plan. And that was largely because we knew that there was the potential for by right development of really the whole property with large lots, large homes, and then also the possibility that sort of non-traditional development like a 40B or an active adult neighborhood could result in many, many more units than that. So we had actually met with a developer years ago who wanted the town to change the zoning so he could build 700 units out there. And that was the scale of things that were being considered. We felt like there was huge potential for that to negatively impact the town's sense of place and quality of life. And we also knew that purchase of the entire property, and now this was back in 2019, would likely cost somewhere between 15 and 20 million. I suspect that number would be even higher today. And we really felt like that was something that was out of reach for the community. So we needed to think creatively about a little bit of a different approach. Fortunately, during that time, Stow Acres had been coming to the town periodically with, different ideas and plans and saying, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? So we were already in dialogue with them. And as it became more and more clear that something was likely to happen, both Stow Conservation Trust and the town got together and said, well, rather than waiting to see what Stow Acres puts on the table, what if we could get together, put some money on the table, hire a landscape planning firm, and develop our own vision for the future of Stow Acres? So we decided to do that. We hired a firm, Dodson and Associates, out of the Northampton area. And we had a conversation with Stow Acres and with MCO and Associates, Mark O'Hagan, who was a developer that they were in communication with at the time. We told them that we wanted to do this. This was during COVID. It was sitting outside town building at the picnic table. And they were, in a word, pretty skeptical and wanted to know what this would mean for them, whether or not they would have to contribute financially to this effort, whether they would be bound by the results, how long it would take. I mean, you might imagine that they looked a little bit skeptically at both of us conservation organizations. And we said, just join us. We're not going to ask you to pay, but we would like you to participate in this planning effort, with sort of no expectations about follow through if they weren't happy with what came out of it. So we began a period of about a year of working pretty intensively with them, with our land use planner, having community meetings, having focus groups. We were all trying to learn how to use Zoom at the time, remembering those dark days. And our goals were really to shape the future of the property in a way that would avoid the piecemeal sale of different parts of the real estate and would also advance the town's open space recreation and housing goals. I am condensing a huge amount of work and time into one very short slide, but we made the decision during that process that we wanted to break this into a two-phase project, one phase that would focus on the South Course and one phase that would focus on the North Course. We negotiated terms with Stow Acres, and we brought those two phases to town meeting in May and October of 2021, both of which received overwhelming positive votes of approval. And this is the original vision plan that was presented to the community back at that time. And essentially the way the real estate divided up, if you will, is that the South Course, which was the first phase, would be encumbered with a permanent conservation restriction that would keep the land in golf use. It also allowed agricultural, some recreational and open space uses of the property. We negotiated the right to put a recreational trail around the perimeter of the property, and it would be continued to be owned by Stow Acres and continued to be used for golfing purposes. So that was the south course. And then the north course would be divided into two parcels, with the town purchasing 2/3 of the north course for conservation and recreation uses, and then a developer purchasing the remaining third of the golf course to be developed for a mixed residential housing development. And part of the terms of the town's purchase of the 2/3 is that we would lease back a portion of that land to Stow Acres for a period of time. So I'll talk about that in a future slide. So that was the original vision. We have been busy continuing to work to execute that vision, and we did complete the conservation restriction on the south course in December of 2021. Some of you may have been on the inaugural hike that we had out there with about 200 people. But we've built a trail around the perimeter of the south course. It's called the Mapledale Trail. We have maps of the trail on our website if people want to go out and take a walk. It's quite a beautiful trail down at the southern end of the south course. You have beautiful views out over Orchard Hill, which is the farm that's located in Gleasondale. On the north course, we completed that acquisition on the town's behalf in January of 2023. We needed that time between the town meeting vote and the actual acquisition to secure all of the funds we needed to complete the purchase, which was part of it was town CPA funds. We also received nearly $1 million in a state municipal vulnerability preparedness grant. And then Stow Conservation Trust also contributed funds that they raised. The north course is technically divided between two parcels. So the Conservation Commission acquired 24 acres around the driving range and in the wetlands in the front of the property. And then the Recreation Commission acquired about 90 acres to the rear. We had to draw those lines somewhat quickly during this planning process. So we also have an MOU between the two entities that commits both conservation and recreation to this master planning process that we're engaged in right now, and to kind of abiding by what comes out of that plan at the end of the day. So even though the real estate is divided this way, I think that there will be conservation uses on much of the recreation parcel, if that makes sense. I mentioned the lease back of some of the land to Stow Acres, and this is a little bit of a complicated map, but just to give you a sense of how the town's control of this land is being phased. We currently control everything that's shown in green on this map, which is not a lot of land, and much of it is wet. As of January of 2025, so just a number of months from now, we will gain control of these two fairways and holes that are shown in pink on the map. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then in January of 2028, the driving range that's on the north course that's shown here in orange will come under the town's control. It's still being used as a driving range until then. And then there are 9 years remaining in the golf lease for 9 holes of golf that are shown in the blue area. So it's a little bit complicated, but I think it's important to have a sense of the fact that this is going to be phased over a fairly long period of time. I mentioned the mixed income housing development. The town was fortunate to be able to have quite a bit of input into the mix of units that are going to be there, the affordability levels, the architectural renderings were prepared by the land use planning firm that was working with all of us. and really consistent with what the developer has done in the past. There's a small development in Harvard that's very similar to this that's currently being rented out. The plans are currently before the Zoning Board of Appeals. There is a ZBA meeting the first Monday of pretty much every month that has been devoted to this plan. They are reaching the end of the process, I think, and expected to close the public hearings in July and then render a decision. And I can say that the plans that are being reviewed by the ZBA are really substantially similar to what came out of our master planning process. So again, you know, the developer, who's the same developer, has really stuck with that vision. So that was the kind of quick reminder of the history of how we got to where we are today. Switching over to talk a little bit about the restoration issues and the reuse of the property. So when the town received a grant from the MVP program for the acquisition of the North Course, they gave us a 2-year grant. And the first year was the acquisition funding. The second year was funding to prepare a climate resilience master plan for the property. Obviously, having put $1 million into the property, the MVP program was very interested in how the town was going to use it and wanted to see us as much as possible working to improve the climate resiliency of the property. The Climate Resilience Master Plan covers all of the land that the town acquired as part of the Phase 2 purchase, which is shown here in the darker orange. And then we also folded in a piece of town-owned land that the Concom owned off of Fairway Drive, and the rear of the development parcel where the wells are for that project, and which will really be kept in an open state. And part of the thinking there is we really wanted to think about our use of the property and the rear of the development parcel in a way that married the two parcels together, so that trails might, for example, extend across property lines, so that whatever we were thinking about for the town's property would be consistent with what the developer was doing on his side of the line. We hired BSC Group as our consultants through an RFP process. And over the last year, we've done an incredible amount of community outreach and are really just about ready to present the draft plan. We are required to have it done by the end of June by the terms of the grant. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to talk about the plan tonight, but I am going to talk about a piece of it, which is the restoration component. So when you look at Stow Acres on a map of kind of high biodiversity areas, one of the interesting things that you see is that all of this land in gray on this map is really considered degraded habitat. And that's because it's a golf course. And so what we have here is really an incredible opportunity to work with what's almost a blank slate and think about how we improve the ecological functions of the property. So we're looking at things like wetland restoration, we're looking at stream bank enhancement, we're looking at restoration of upland areas, whether that be converting them to open meadows or actually reforesting some areas. We want to ideally manage some of the invasive species on the property to reduce that stress on the ecological systems, and at the same time increase species diversity in the property, and just overall kind of recreate corridors on the property, and then think about how this property sits in a larger landscape context. So one of the things that's interesting to me is that when you back up from Stow Acres and you zoom out, we have a very interesting north-south corridor that's developing through this section of Stow. That includes, all the way, say, from the Hudson Rod and Gun Club, some other town land in Hudson, the former Perkins Farm in Gleasondale, onto the south course, the north course, across the river, to the large parcel of land that's off of Gates Lane, up to Marble Hill, up to Minuteman Airfield, Flag Hill, and beyond. So we really have this corridor that's stretching through the whole town. And how do we think about enhancing that? and enhancing the whole system. So we can think sort of site scale, or we can also think larger scale. We are not alone in looking at a golf course as a potential restoration site. This was an article that was in the New York Times just actually a couple of months ago about how all across the country, golf courses are closing, land trusts, municipalities, state agencies are buying golf courses and are looking at how to rewild and improve ecological functions on those properties. So there's some really interesting case studies in this article, none of them from Massachusetts, but maybe next time we'll be in the next article. So I think it's sort of a testament to my identity that about 50 people sent me this article and said, did you see this? But more locally, we are also looking at a couple of very interesting restoration projects that are happening in Massachusetts. In the city of Northampton, the city acquired the Pine Grove Golf Course, and they're about a year or two ahead of us. They also got an MVP grant for their project. They are working with the State Division of Ecological Restoration. They also have a consultant on board. And so they've started this process already of beginning to rewild that golf course and improve habitat there. And we are talking with them. We're talking with the Division of Ecological Restoration. We're actually going to do a site visit out there in the coming weeks to try to learn from their experiences. These are just a couple of photographs of the Northampton course from what it looked like in January 2020 to last year, or sorry, July of 2022. And you can see that in a fairly short period of time, there's a lot of stuff already starting to happen there. And I think one of the interesting things to think about when we're doing restoration is, where do we just kind of let nature take its course and monitor what's happening? And where do we actually intervene to think about helping it along, either to happen faster or to happen in a way that we want it to happen? And then similarly in Plymouth is a project that both Bob Wilbur and I have had some involvement with at Tidmarsh Farm, which is the largest inland wetland restoration in Massachusetts. This was a very large cranberry bog system that was owned by a couple that had quite a vision for what they wanted to see on the property. They were able to work with state and federal agencies, obtain a lot of grants. This was a place where there was a lot of active intervention to begin to rewild the landscape. But again, you can see in just a period of 3 years how this landscape has been transformed from kind of a weedy cranberry bog monoculture into a very diverse wetland system. And it's continuing to evolve today. It's now owned by Mass Audubon and operated as one of their wildlife sanctuaries. And again, just a couple of photographs of Tidmarsh Farm before the restoration and a very short period after. So as we think about wetland restoration at Stow Acres, and anywhere really, I think it's helpful to think about it in 3 different categories. One is ecological restoration of altered sites and habitats. So that is really what we are doing at Stow Acres. Another one is, if you have to have unavoidable impacts from a development project or a dam project or whatever the project is, you can do restoration as a way to mitigate those impacts. And you can also use it to just enhance ecological functions on a well-functioning piece of property, including trying to enhance climate resilience. But before we do restoration, or sort of as we prepare to do restoration, these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. We need to understand the history of the site. What was there before? What might want to come back there? What's the site hydrology and topography? How is that going to shape what happens in the landscape? We need to look at constraints. In our case, for example, we want to have an access road that goes into the property that will allow people to get out on the property. That's potentially a constraint. We have to design our wetland restoration project around that. And again, kind of what would happen if we let nature take its course? Where do we want to intervene? The pond that's in the center of this photo is a man-made pond. It's fed by a man-made canal that goes around the driving range. That canal diverts the stream from the path that it used to take when it was at Stow Acres. So these are all places that we're looking at where there's been man-made alteration, and we have to make decisions about what we leave and what we try to put back the way it was. So, for example, as we begin to try to understand the history of this site, this yellow line here is Randall Road, for people who know it. The driving range parking lot is right here. This is the former driving range. It was once a forested swamp. We know that the overall direction of groundwater flow is from west to east through the property. This is going back to 1938 to give you a sense of what was there before the golf course. If we go to 1965, we can see that alteration has started here. That pond that I just showed in the photograph has been created. And there's the beginning of some channelization to drain the area. I know I saw Chip on earlier. I don't know if he's here, but he lives right here with this river going around the property. And then going further forward in time, we can really see where the alteration began happening at Stow Acres. This is 1971. The canal has been created that feeds this pond. The driving range has been cleared and graded. And there's been a lot of channelization of the water bodies in the area. So this cedar swamp that was up here in the corner that is still a notable feature on the landscape used to just sit out there as a little pond, and now it's all channelized and the water is feeding down into this area. So there's been a lot of alteration of hydrology over time. When we look at the landscape as it is today on the right, so here's that cedar pond, here's the driving range, this is the end of a couple of the holes on the golf course. We can superimpose those same lines on an old historic aerial and see that this whole area was wetland at one time. So that gives us a lot of information about what might want to be there in the future. We can look at soils and we can see that we have hydric soils that are kind of in this area around the driving range and extending over to that ponded area, the irrigation ponds. So I'm just going to go through some of these quickly, but just to give you a kind of sense of the things that we're thinking about. In addition to understanding the site history, we want to begin to understand the hydrology. So we've been working with our consulting team to go out and do some soil test pits, to put in monitoring wells, to really try to understand what's the water table like there now, how much fill is there that we might have to deal with in the future. And then they're going to be installing monitoring wells that we will continue to monitor in the coming years. Right now, our groundwater table is very high, but that is going to fluctuate. And we want to understand what those fluctuations look like across the site over time. We can look at the location of the 500-year floodplain, which is not something that's typically protected. Most of the protection happens of the 100-year floodplain. But we also know as a result of climate changes that we're going to start seeing more frequent, more intense rainfalls, potentially more flooding, and that 500-year floodplain is likely to become more important over time. So that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. And then from all of that work, our consultants have identified what they're kind of calling an opportunity zone in this area, where we do have some opportunity for wetland restoration. Not to say that we're going to do all of it, but there's opportunity there. The other thing that we've tried to do over the last year is to really understand wetland aside, what the unique ecological features of the property are and how we might enhance them and how we might build on them. So our consultants have gone out and identified a number of these resources. We have a large pond in the rear of the property. The man-made canal is a really interesting feature, and there's a lot of opportunity there for stream bank restoration. We have undersized culverts that may need to be replaced. And then just skipping ahead, we've got some beaver activity on the property. What might that mean? There's a beautiful vernal pool along the edge of the property. As I mentioned, we were just out certifying yesterday. So a lot of different kinds of habitats that we're looking at in the mix on the property. And the other thing that we've done is to really bring in some citizen science to help us understand the property. So there's a online app called iNaturalist, and it really allows anybody to go out in the field, identify species. If you're not sure what it is, you can take a picture of it, upload it, and other people will help you identify it. And so we created an iNaturalist project at Stow Acres, which is called the Stow Climate Resilience and Biodiversity Project. We have been adding site observations to that over the last 8 months. And just yesterday, we added 60 species to the iNaturalist project with the help of all the statewide conservation administrators. So it's a really fun project. It allows us to get a good baseline of what's on the property now and kind of understand how it might change going forward. We also put up a number of trail cameras on the property, and we had a group of students in a science class at Neshoba who were the ones that mined through all of the photographs. They created data on what species they could see using the property, how many times they saw different things, whether it was otters or bobcat or coyotes. And then each of the students made these really fun posters about the different species they saw on the property. So it was a fun way to get some of the kids at the high school involved in the project. And then we've also had our consultants do a complete invasive species survey of the property so that we can understand, kind of where we're starting from. And as part of the mapping process, they also did some recommendations about where to start, what to attack first, what different management options there are for different species. So we have not yet started to eradicate invasive species, but that's kind of the next step as we go forward with things. And I should mention that much of this information, including that invasive species management plan, is online on the town's website. So as we've begun to understand the site better, we can think about what are some of the kinds of restoration that we might want to do on the property. I think I don't want to say the lowest hanging fruit because it's a really complicated project, but the thing that we've known that we wanted to do from the outset was to restore the driving range to wetland, which is why I focused a bit on that. And this is the driving range today, and our consultants helped us pull together some graphics of, what a restored driving range might look like, the idea of having some overlooks. They also are starting to think about, as we restore wetland there, what might we expect to happen? So we know that when irrigation reduces and then ultimately stops at the golf course, we're likely to see changes in hydrology. We're likely to see water levels increase across the property as a whole. So that's something that we have to plan for. We're also likely to see an increase in bird activity on the property as diversity increases. There are likely to be early successional species that would happen, like grasses and wildflowers, more of a wet meadow environment. Over time, that would succeed into a scrub shrub wetland, where you might start to see some wetland shrubs, some saplings coming in, and then ultimately succeeding to a forested wetland. So part of kind of planning for the wetland restoration is thinking about, what do we want to see there long term? Do we want to let this successional process occur? Do we make an intentional decision that we want to keep this at an early successional stage? And then how do we manage that? Or, a mid-successional stage? Is it all or nothing? Is it some parts one thing, some parts the other? So there's a lot of decision making that has to happen. I am not going to begin to try to explain all of the slide, but this is sort of the early thinking about how we might think about the wetland restoration there, some things that we might do to create some different kinds of habitats out there. The stage that we are at right now is a very conceptual design of the wetland restoration. Before we can go forward into actual implementation of that, we'll need to do actual design and engineering and permitting. So there'll be a lot more information. This is just at a very concept level. And then across the site, our consultants are beginning to develop some recommendations for things like taking some of the existing sand traps and enhancing them for turtle nesting habitat. They are interested in seeing whether we might be a Head Start site for the Blandings turtle. We know that we have them at Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge, but they are, to our knowledge, not on this property or in this part of Stowe, but it might be a great site for them. There's a small area where they're interested in trying to create a heron rookery. Lots of different ideas that are starting to bubble up as we work on plans for the property. And then, not to be forgotten, is what do we do with all the upland and all the fairways? So, there are a couple of ideas. One is to do some wildflower meadows, some open meadow habitat, and I think we've got some sites that we're going to propose for that. And then the other idea is to try to take some of the areas that abut the better forest habitat on the site and really begin to try to extend the forest outward and do some planting of trees and shrubs in those areas. I'm almost done. Just to get a sense of wetland or other restoration processes, it's a long-term effort. So we are very much at the planning and assessment phase right now. Once we've got consensus on concept plans, we will begin to move forward to engineering and design, then to permitting, and then to construction. And then once construction happens, there's ongoing monitoring. So it really is a lengthy process to go through all of this, but we are just getting started. To wrap up, some of the challenges that we have as we move forward, one is really that this is such a long-term project. And so it's challenging to keep the public engaged and interested over the long term, as we're talking about the master plan and we're talking about land that isn't even going to come within Stow's control for 10 years. It's hard to think about planning for that. We are actually very grateful that the golf course is continuing use of the driving range for that 5-year, now 4-year period, because it gives us the time to do the planning and the design and the permitting and the engineering and then be ready to go when they're ready to leave the driving range. Another big challenge is restoration at this scale. So if we were only talking about restoring the driving range, this would be a huge project. We're talking about a 20-acre driving range and a 100+ acre property. So it really is a very large project. It's going to take a lot of funding to accomplish all of this. And finding the funding that we need is a challenge, although there is a lot of restoration funding available right now from public agencies. It requires a lot of technical expertise. And also, nothing that we do is static. So we're always, even as we begin construction, needing to evaluate and monitor what's happening out there and adapt. So we can't have plans that are set in stone. We have to be willing to adapt. A great example of that is as we worked on the master plan, we had this idea that maybe there'd be a small recreation building, which was something that people told us they wanted. And it seemed like a great spot to put it was close to that irrigation pond. It's a nice flat spot, beautiful views out over the pond. And the more we talked with our consultants, the more we said, wow, if the groundwater tables rise over that whole site, that might not be the best place to put a building. So let's put it in a higher spot. And that was a change we decided to make. And then the final challenge is really monitoring and management cost. So I will be completely candid and say that this project terrifies me at some level. You know, the conservation department right now is stretched, trying to manage what we already have. I think we all know that the recreation department is stretched, trying to manage what they have. And this is a huge piece of management over the long term. So, you know, it is going to require the town to step up and, you know, provide the staffing that's needed to make sure that this is something that once we do it, we have the capacity to take care of it. So I think I'm going to stop there. I'll stop sharing and I'm happy to try to answer questions.
That's great. Certainly, we're a small enough group that if people have questions, please just raise your hand and we'll answer them. One question I have to start off, given that this is an historic golf course, I mean, the fact that it started out as the black-owned golf course, is in the plans anything about preserving a building or making some type of historic memorial for that fact?
The Mapledale Country Club was on the south course. And so, and the historic Hale Randall house that's there was part of that country club. I know that the folks who are involved in the Rediscover Mapledale group, which is the group that's trying to commemorate the history of Mapledale, are looking at having some kind of a monument or sculpture or something like that. It would probably be on the south course. The park that the town will ultimately create will need a name. It could be named Mapledale, but that wasn't where the course was. So, you know, that's been kicked around as an idea. I think the developer is going to name one of his streets after Mapledale. So there's a lot of thinking going on about that right now. And I know they're planning to have a golf tournament this coming August. That will also be a fundraiser for some of the Rediscover Mapledale efforts. We are working with them on a interpretive signage loop that will be on the Mapledale Trail on the south course. So we went out and identified some spots where it made sense to put interpretive signage because, say, we knew that the Mapledale course was in that spot. Thanks to some folks locally, we do have some information on where the historic course was, you know, that we can kind of build off of. But yeah, that's all on the south course.
Great. Dave Kay has asked a question in the chat. Is there any thought that this area might provide a public water supply?
I don't think that's something that was talked about as a purpose of the acquisition, if you will. So the state takes a pretty narrow view. You know, once you legally acquire land for conservation purposes, it has to be conservation purposes. Same with recreation. We have in the past acquired parcels of land for conservation and water supply purposes, you know, with that specific thought in mind. So we do have a potential well site at Carver Hill that was called out in the conservation restriction. The former Cornelius property is a potential water supply site. We have gone to the legislature and gotten approval for a potential water supply site off of Heritage Lane. So there are a number of spots, but I don't think that's been thought about on this property.
Rick?
So Kathy, I was interested when you mentioned in passing the development of the residential housing and how that would work. And you mentioned Devon's. In this series about 2 years ago, we went out to Devon's, and my question is to tour some of those houses with the architect. My question is what we saw there, what you've got planned? And I don't know if you saw that program, but they were it was such an exciting development in terms of its sensitive use and layout. and mixed use housing. That was, you know, it's like, if it wasn't that Stowe was so great, I'd sell and move out there today. It was really nice. I don't know if this is the same developer, if you know that development at Devon's.
I don't know that development at Devon's. I do know somebody that was on the Devon's planning team. This developer has done a number of projects. He's got one off of, I think it's Sugar Road in Bolton. So if you come off of 495 by the Candy Mansion, it's right tucked in there. And then he has a small development that he's just finished and is marketing, and it's either Harvard or Lancaster,
Mhm.
which are units that are very similar in their appearance to these.
Yeah, I
So
think one of the other things about Devon's is that they were highly energy efficient in terms of their construction and things that they did to enable that type of energy efficiency in terms of insulation, in terms of tightness of the house, the envelope, roofs that face south for potential solar, so they were solar ready, using heat pumps, induction, et cetera.
Yep. It
The
looks
other
like Mike just commented that the developer was a guy named Dan Gainsborough in Devon's. So
The
this
other
is
thing that was
person.
nice about them is the way the houses were clustered and related to open space, which seems like a good idea for any development, you know, in Stowe Acres. I realize it's a separate parcel, but
Yeah, that is definitely something that is very much top of mind. So we will have, you know, nature trails and also some bike accessible trails in the plan for the town land at Stowe Acres, and those trails will interconnect with a trail network that will go through the development. They are potentially, we're still working out the exact location, but they're going to provide an access from the development into the park area so that if I'm a resident and I live in that development, I don't have to go all the way out the access road, turn,
exactly.
come all the way back in again, you know, I can just cut across. So we definitely have been working together on, and the ZBA has been part of those conversations on, you know, how do we plan across that property line?
That video is available on Stowe TV, the video of that program.
Okay.
So if it's of
That was
any
one I
use
missed.
in your archives or to
Mhm.
show people working, you might look it up.
Yeah.
So one other, you have a lot of decisions to make. You just ran through all the, you know, almost every element, there's a decision. Do you go this way? Do you go that way? Do you let nature take its course, or do you do some intervention? What is the planning process for how you make those decisions? What dictates, how do you evaluate?
I think it's in large part really trying to listen to the land and what the land wants to be. But then there also are, you know, well, we don't really know, and we've got to choose A or B. We are going to be relying heavily on the expertise of the State Division of Ecological Restoration. This is what they do day in and day out. I will, as long as I've been doing this work, which is for my whole career, I've never restored a wetland myself. So, you know, I think looking to them for their guidance and expertise, looking to our consultants to help us frame those decision points. And then, you know, I think as we've been doing with all of this planning work, you know, as much as possible, bringing it to the public and saying, okay, you know, where we do have a real clear A or B choice, you know, what do people think and what do you all want to see? So
Mhm.
I don't imagine that we'll start putting shovels in the ground for 4 years. You know, in terms of the driving range restoration, we will start because, and I should have touched on this, but in that pink area, if you remember the map where I was saying this land is going to come to the control of the town in the next year, we are really going to try, and it's something that we've thought about in our master planning effort, to look for ways to get people out there in the short term and begin to enjoy the property. So we've already started constructing some trails out there. There'll be some, what I've been calling kind of early wins in terms of opportunities to get people out, using the property, enjoying the property, picnicking on the property, on the piece that comes to the control of the town. And it's actually my favorite part of the golf course. It's quite beautiful there. So.
Any other questions? Well, if not, I have another one.
That's okay.
Given you mentioned climate change and the likelihood, I mean, this was a wetlands originally. There's
Yep.
a lot of water there, and so we do know that there's a lot of wetlands around in Stowe. What are the predictions for how much this whole area would be more wetlands than dry, in terms of, you know, I'm always fascinated by the bog, which was pretty wet, but how they restored it. And so thinking about that, um, what's, how is the factor of what's going to happen given climate change going to impact some of the decisions that you make on the property?
It's interesting when you look at Stowe Acres from Randall Road, and you can't see all the way to Elizabeth Brook because it's quite far in the back. But when you look from Randall Road, you look out over the driving range, or you look out over what's a fairly low area. And that is the area that in the past was wetland, or I think has the greatest chance of some of it, not all of it, being wetland in the future. And then the land rises up pretty significantly as you go toward the back. So I think that area, while there has been man-made alterations, certainly over the years, it is largely upland and isn't likely to go back to wetlands, even under higher rainfall scenarios. I do think that one of the things we want to look at as we design the restoration for the driving range is opportunities to enhance flood storage on the property. So in that 500-year floodplain, there is an opportunity to deepen some areas to create enhanced flood storage. And we don't have a huge problem with flooding from the Assabet River, but we could, so I think anything that we can do on that front is a good thing.
How much fill was needed to create the golf course? And are you anticipating removing a lot of that fill?
I think on that front, I would say we don't know yet. I had shown one graphic earlier that they were starting to try to estimate the depth of the fill. Really, we need to get an excavator out there and dig some holes, and we can't do that while the driving range is in operation. But we are starting just from soil borings to get a sense of how much fill is out there. There is a strong desire not to remove fill if that's possible, because then we're disturbing the soil and potentially releasing carbon. So as much as we can work with what's there, we may do that. That driving range really wants to be a wetland again. The beavers are helping. They are doing their darndest to try to reflood the driving range. And, I think if you were out there early spring, the swamp that's just to the west of the driving range was really spilling out onto the range. And if you let the beavers continue to dam that stream, that's just going to happen more and more. So it may be that that area can go back to being wetlands without removing a lot of the fill. I think there will have to be selective fill removal in some places. And what our consultants have said that they have done with other wetland restoration projects that are similar is they go out and they do something called scarifying the soil. So they'll take a backhoe or an excavator and just kind of fluff up the top layer of the soil and create pits and mounds that gives it a little bit more topographic diversity and, some opportunity for some pools and then some areas that are vegetated. What we don't want to have happen is have the whole driving range turn into a lake. Because while that might be scenic, it's not really the habitat goal we have in mind there.
Mm-hmm. You've clearly done research about other projects that have done restorations, and and really work to try and rewild that area or restore the wetlands. What lessons have you learned from them? What lessons have they shared that would help inform you in how we work here?
I think, I think we're just learning those. Like, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to go out to the Northampton Golf Course and learn a little bit more from them. But the biggest lesson that we're hearing from multiple golf course projects is this notion that once you stop irrigating, you are going to get an increase in the water table. And so that is something that we have to plan for. And it's creating issues as we think about access to the property, use of that front part of the property, which is so low. So I think that's probably the number one thing, is just to be prepared to see some hydrologic changes on the property.
Mhm.
The other thing I guess I would add is, we know that we're going to have to proactively address some of the invasive species issues out there. If we did nothing, if we just let nature take its course, we know that we probably would see a lot of invasives. So for example, our consultants have recommended that our first efforts to remove invasives be at the edges of the fairways, because if those are left, that's what's going to want to march outward. But if we remove what's at the edges, we create more opportunity for the native vegetation to come in. One of the things we negotiated with Stow Acres as part of the purchase of the property and the lease back of the retained rights is that they are willing, or they will, mow the property at an interval of our choosing for the short term. So as long as they're operating the golf course out there, if we say, well, we're not really ready to do this section of the property yet in terms of restoration, but we just want you to mow it once a year, keep it as open meadow, keep the invasives down, they will do that. But it's a frequency of our choosing. So, we're not going to keep it as turf. But it might be a once a year mow, it might be a once every 2 year mow, just to make sure that we're not going to lose those areas to, early succession of invasives.
All right.
Would be great. I know from personal experience that when you stop cutting an area, you're in trouble and you can't quite catch up again.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I have a multi-flora rose forest in my front yard if I stop mowing.
Yeah, so I guess the only way to remove invasives is just to dig them up. I certainly don't anticipate that you're using pesticides or anything of that nature.
So what we have from our consultants is a species by species kind of best practices for removal. So what's the best time of year? What's the best method? Certain things grouped together. So like honeysuckle or burning bush or buckthorn, or kind of all the woody invasives that get similar treatment. There are a handful of invasives that I will say there's really no way to manage except by very selectively using herbicide. I am a licensed pesticide applicator, so I could potentially do that for the town. That's not something we're eager to do. And, probably the most difficult species to eradicate without herbicide is knotweed. We are fortunate we do not have knotweed on the property, at least not yet. So hopefully that'll change. So.
Yeah. Well, great. Are there any other questions? Does anybody have any other questions for Kathy? Seeing none, I'd like to thank.
Can I just say, I see Chip Fine is here, and I don't want to put him on the spot, but he is our neighbor at Stow Acres. He's building a new house there. And he has actually already started in removing invasives on his property. So
Great, Chip. We'll all take lessons from you.
Yeah, Chip, come over here. I need some lessons.
he said thanks.
Well, without any other questions, I want to really thank Kathy for a very enlightening presentation and really quite exciting about the potential. It is long-term, but it would be great to be part of that as we go forward.
Sharon, may I ask, this is Carol Ehrlich. May I ask one question?
Absolutely, Carol.
I couldn't find the mute button fast enough. So Kathy and all of you, thank you so much for the presentation. One of the questions that I have is, how come when the irrigation stops, the water table rises? Like, it seems counterintuitive. What am I
I guess the
missing?
way I think about it is Stow Acres is pulling water out of this very defined low area that's close to the
Oh,
drainage range.
okay.
It's taking that water and it's spreading it out all over the entire north course. And some of that is probably happening during the day in the sun when there's evapotranspiration of some of that water. Some of it is finding its way into Elizabeth Brook and not back to where it came from. So it's all the same watershed, but it's going off in a different direction. So it's
Okay.
it's sort of like if you had rain barrels on your property and and just started spreading it around other places. It doesn't end up back in the barrel except in the very long term.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, is there anyone else who needed to find the mute button? Who has a question to ask? If not, again, I'd like to thank Kathy. This has been a great presentation and I learned a lot. So
Thank you. Well, stay tuned for our great experiment.
Absolutely. I would like to thank Tina and let everybody know that next month we will have another presentation on the third Wednesday. Stay tuned. We have a potential topic, but I don't want to announce it too soon because we need to shore up our speakers. So look forward to the announcement and everyone have a good evening. Thank you, Tina.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank you
Have
so
a great
much.
night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.